I traveled each and every byway.
I sing all kinds. I don't sound like nobody. Elvis Presley, the legendary singer known as the King of Rock and Roll. His unmistakable voice, charisma, and distinctive style made him one of the most famous entertainers the world had ever known. Millions of people still remember him through songs such as Can't Help Falling in Love, a timeless love song that continues to move listeners decades later. Why did a man who seemed to have everything, fame, wealth, talent, and millions of fans, die on August 16, 1977 at just 42 years old? What was the real cause of his death? And nearly half a century later, why has the world still failed to find anyone capable of taking his crown? But Elvis's story did not begin with fame, wealth, or screaming crowds. He was born into a poor working-class family in Tupelo, Mississippi, where money was always a struggle. Even during his early years, Elvis faced people who doubted his musical abilities and was even told that he could not sing. So, how many hardships and how much determination did Elvis have to endure to become one of the most influential voices in the history of popular music? How did a young man with no formal musical training manage to create a sound that would change American music forever? Then his career exploded. Elvis's movements on stage, hairstyle, clothing, and bold performance style shocked conservative America at the time. While many teenagers became obsessed with him, others condemned what they considered dangerous and provocative behavior. Why could Elvis make an entire country go wild over him, while at the same time making so many people furious? Let us look back at the short but extraordinary and dazzling life of Elvis Presley, the man the world would forever remember as the King. Part 2. From Poverty to the Beginning of a Dream. How could a boy from a family so poor that they sometimes depended on food assistance eventually become the King of Rock and Roll? On January 8, 1935, in the small town of Tupelo, Mississippi, a boy named Elvis Aaron Presley was born into a family that had very little money, but plenty of love. His parents, Vernon and Gladys Presley, struggled to make ends meet. There was no wealth, no prestigious family name, and certainly no sign that their son would one day become one of the most recognizable entertainers in the world. Their life was shaped by financial hardship, uncertainty, and the constant struggle to provide even the basics. But Elvis's childhood carried another kind of weight. He was born as a twin. His brother, Jesse Garon Presley, was stillborn, leaving Elvis to grow up as an only child. The loss deeply affected his family, and Elvis remained especially close to his mother, Gladys. Their bond was unusually strong. She was not simply his mother, she was the person he trusted most and one of the most important influences in his early life. For the young Elvis, home was modest and opportunities were limited. Yet somewhere within that difficult childhood, something began to emerge: music. At church, Elvis heard gospel songs filled with emotion and powerful voices. Around him, he was also exposed to the sounds of country music and the blues that were deeply rooted in the American South. He did not yet know where these sounds would lead him. He was simply listening. But perhaps that was the beginning of everything. While other children dreamed of ordinary futures, Elvis seemed increasingly drawn toward music. He was still shy, and there was nothing about him at this stage that suggested the extraordinary performer he would become. He had no formal musical education and no wealthy connections waiting to open doors for him. He was simply a poor boy with a growing love for music. And that raises a fascinating question. What was it about this quiet boy from Tupelo that would eventually make millions of people scream his name? How could someone who grew up with so little develop a voice, presence, and style powerful enough to shake the entire music industry? At this point, Elvis was still unknown. No one was calling him the King. No one was waiting outside concert halls to see him. No record company was fighting for his signature. There was only a young boy, a struggling family, a mother he adored, and a growing dream that seemed almost impossible. But sometimes the greatest stories begin long before anyone realizes that history is being made. Part 3. The Little Guitar and the Dream No One Could See. At the age of 11, Elvis Presley received a gift that seemed ordinary at the time: a guitar. It was not an expensive instrument, and no one could have imagined that this simple guitar would become the beginning of a journey that would change American music forever. Elvis had originally wanted something else, but instead he received a guitar, and slowly, almost quietly, the instrument became part of his life. Yet there was something surprising about the future king of rock and roll. He was extremely shy. The boy who would one day command enormous stages and send thousands of fans into a frenzy was not naturally comfortable performing in front of people. Singing in public could make him nervous. At this stage, there was no sign of the fearless performer the world would later recognize. So how did that shy boy find the courage to step onto a stage? Elvis began appearing in small local performances and talent contests. He also had opportunities to sing on radio programs, allowing people in his community to hear his voice. These early appearances were modest compared with what would come later, but they gave Elvis something far more important than fame. They gave him experience. And then, when Elvis was 13, his family made a decision that would change his life. They moved from Tupelo to Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis was completely different from the small Mississippi community where Elvis had grown up. It was a city alive with music. Gospel poured from churches. Blues could be heard throughout the city. Country music remained popular, while rhythm and blues was developing a powerful identity of its own. For a young Elvis, Memphis was almost like entering another world. He listened. He watched. And most importantly, he absorbed everything. Gospel influenced the emotion in his singing. Country contributed its storytelling and musical roots. Blues and R&B introduced him to sounds, rhythms, and performance styles that were very different from the music of his childhood. Little by little, Elvis began creating something that belonged to him. His music became different, his clothes became different, his hair became different. Even the way he carried himself began to change. But being different came with a price. Some classmates did not understand Elvis's appearance or his growing passion for music. His hairstyle and clothing could make him stand out, and being different in a world that expected young men to look and behave a certain way was not always easy. Why would this shy teenager deliberately choose to stand apart from everyone else? Perhaps Elvis himself did not yet know the answer. He only knew that music made him feel alive. And somewhere beneath the uncertainty, embarrassment, and criticism, a new identity was beginning to form. The shy boy from Tupelo was slowly becoming a performer. But there was still one question no one could answer. If Elvis had never received that little guitar at 11, would the world have ever known the man who would become the king? At the time, nobody in Memphis could have imagined what was coming next. Part 4. The Boy They Told Couldn't Sing. Before Elvis Presley became the king of rock and roll, there was a time when even the people around him were not convinced that he could become a professional singer. As his passion for music grew stronger, his attention began to move away from school. His academic performance suffered, while music increasingly occupied his thoughts. Elvis was not following the path that teachers and adults expected from him. He was becoming obsessed with sounds, voices, rhythms, and performers. But passion alone did not guarantee success. Elvis had no formal musical training. He did not learn music through prestigious teachers or professional institutions. Instead, he learned by listening. He listened carefully to the singers around him. He studied their voices, their timing, their emotions, and the way they delivered a song. Then he tried to reproduce what he heard, slowly developing an instinctive understanding of music. Gospel became one of his most important influences. The powerful voices he heard in church taught him how emotion could transform a simple melody. Country music gave him another musical foundation, while blues and rhythm and blues exposed him to sounds that would later become essential to his own style. But before the world recognized his unusual talent, Elvis had to face rejection. Some people who heard him did not believe he had what it took to become a successful singer. He was still inexperienced, still developing his voice, and still searching for an identity of his own. One of the most painful moments came when Elvis auditioned for Eddie Bond. Instead of telling the young man that he had found his calling, Bond reportedly advised him to continue driving a truck. Imagine hearing that when you are dreaming of becoming a professional musician. What would you have done? Would you have listened to the criticism and returned to an ordinary job? Or would you have continued pursuing a dream that almost nobody else could see? For Elvis, the rejection did not end the dream. It became another obstacle to overcome. There was no guarantee that he would succeed. He had no powerful record label behind him, no established reputation, and no formal musical education. All he had was his voice, his guitar, his ears, and an extraordinary determination to keep learning. And perhaps that was exactly what made him different. Elvis did not simply copy one musical tradition. He absorbed pieces of many worlds, gospel, country, blues, and R&B, and gradually began blending them into something that sounded like his own. The irony is striking. The man who would eventually sell millions of records and become one of the most influential performers in American music was once a young man being told that singing might not be his future. How could the boy who was advised to keep driving a truck become the man who would make an entire generation dance? At that moment, Elvis was still far from becoming the king. But the next opportunity was already waiting, and when it finally arrived, everything was about to change. Part 5. The Fateful Night at Sun Records. In 1953, Elvis Presley walked into Sun Records in Memphis with a dream that was still almost invisible to the outside world. He was not a famous singer. He did not have a powerful record label behind him. He was simply a young man who believed that his voice might be worth hearing. At Sun Records, Elvis encountered two people who would become crucial to the beginning of his career: Marion Keisker and producer Sam Phillips. At first, however, nothing extraordinary happened. Elvis made recordings, but they did not immediately turn him into a star. There was no sudden explosion of fame, no crowds were waiting outside the studio, no major record company was calling. For a young man who had already faced doubt, this must have been another frustrating period of waiting. How long could he keep believing in a dream when there was still no proof that it would work? But Elvis kept going. Then came July 1954. Inside the small Sun Records studio, Elvis was working with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black. They were trying to find the right sound, but the session was not going according to plan. They played, they stopped, they tried again. Still, something was missing. For a moment, it seemed as though the recording session might end without producing anything remarkable. Then, Elvis suddenly began playing in a completely different way. He picked up his guitar and launched into a lively version of That's All Right. Scotty Moore and Bill Black quickly joined him, and suddenly the atmosphere in the room changed. What had moments earlier felt like a failed recording session now sounded energetic, raw, and completely different from what they had been trying to create. What had just happened? Producer Sam Phillips was listening carefully. He had been searching for a sound that could bridge musical worlds, something that carried the spirit of rhythm and blues but could reach a much wider audience. And in that unexpected performance, Phillips believed he had finally heard it. Elvis was not simply reproducing the music he had heard growing up. He was creating something that felt new. The recording was soon played on local radio, and then something extraordinary happened. Listeners began calling the station. Who was that singer? Where had this strange new sound come from? People wanted to hear it again. For Elvis, this was the first real sign that the years of rejection, uncertainty, and waiting might finally be leading somewhere. The shy young man from Tupelo, who had once been told to keep driving a truck, had suddenly given the world a sound that demanded attention. But this was only the beginning, because no one in that small recording studio could have imagined what would happen next. No one knew that the sound that had just emerged from that little room would go on to change American music forever. Part 6. The Young Man Who Sent America into a Frenzy. After the breakthrough at Sun Records, Elvis Presley began performing more frequently across the American South. At first, the audiences were relatively small, but something unusual began happening whenever he stepped onto a stage. People did not simply listen to Elvis. They reacted to him. His voice was different, but his movements were perhaps even more shocking. Elvis moved his body with a freedom and confidence that audiences of the 1950s were not accustomed to seeing from a young male singer. His legs moved rhythmically, his body followed the music, and his entire performance seemed to become part of the song. Soon, those movements became his signature, and the reaction was immediate. Young women screamed when Elvis appeared. Some rushed toward him. Others became so overwhelmed by the excitement that they fainted. His performances were no longer ordinary musical shows. They were becoming emotional events. But not everyone was impressed. Some young men admired Elvis and wanted to imitate his clothes, hairstyle, and attitude. Others viewed him very differently. They considered his appearance and movements inappropriate, provocative, or threatening to traditional values. Why could one young singer inspire such completely opposite reactions? How could the same performer make one audience adore him while making another audience furious? Part of the answer was the music itself. Elvis had absorbed influences from several musical traditions. Gospel gave his singing emotional power. Country shaped his musical roots. Blues contributed its rhythm and feeling, while R&B influenced the energy and sound of his performances. Instead of keeping these traditions separate, Elvis blended them together. The result was something fresh, something exciting, and something that many people had never heard before. But Elvis was not simply creating a new sound. He was also creating a completely new image of what a young music star could look like. His hairstyle was distinctive. His clothing attracted attention. His movements were unpredictable, and his confidence on stage seemed almost impossible to ignore. The more Elvis performed, the more his reputation grew. He began acquiring colorful nicknames, including the Hillbilly Cat and the Memphis Flash. But eventually, another title would become inseparable from his name: the King of Rock and Roll. Yet before that title became legendary, Elvis was still a young performer trying to understand the extraordinary reaction he was creating. Was it simply his voice? Was it his appearance? Was it the way he moved? Or was it the combination of everything? The music, the attitude, the mystery, and the sense that something new was happening right in front of America. By now, Elvis was no longer just a young man with a guitar. He was becoming a cultural phenomenon, and the controversy surrounding him only made people more curious. Why could one young singer cause an entire country to talk about him? Why were teenagers willing to scream for him while some adults demanded that he be controlled? And most importantly, how could this controversial young man from Mississippi go from a local performer to the biggest music star in America? The answer was coming, because Elvis was about to leave the South behind and take his sound to the entire nation. Part 7. From a Southern Star to the King. Elvis Presley had already become a sensation across the American South, but regional fame was no longer enough. The young man from Mississippi was about to become a national phenomenon. In 1955, Elvis made one of the most important moves of his career when he signed with RCA Victor. The deal was worth $40,000, an extraordinary amount at the time, and it marked a major turning point. For Elvis, it meant something much bigger than money. It meant that the biggest record companies in America were finally taking him seriously. But could he succeed on a national stage? The answer came quickly. In 1956, Elvis released Heartbreak Hotel. The song exploded. It became his first #1 pop hit and sold more than 1 million copies, earning Elvis his first gold record. Suddenly, the young performer who had once struggled to convince people that he could sing was dominating the charts. How could everything have changed so quickly? Only a few years earlier, Elvis had been an unknown young man from a poor family in Tupelo. Now, millions of Americans knew his name. And radio was only the beginning. Elvis began appearing on national television, bringing his voice, appearance, and controversial stage presence directly into living rooms across the country. Families who had never seen him perform could now watch him for themselves. For teenagers, he was exciting. For parents, he was sometimes alarming. But whether people loved Elvis or criticized him, one thing was becoming impossible to deny. Everyone was talking about him. Then came more hits: Hound Dog, Blue Suede Shoes, Jailhouse Rock. Each song strengthened his position and expanded his audience. His music was no longer confined to one region or one particular group of listeners. Elvis was becoming a national obsession. But his influence went beyond the record charts. Young men began copying his hairstyle and clothing. Young women idolized him. His performances became cultural events. His image appeared everywhere. Elvis had crossed a line that very few entertainers ever cross. He was no longer simply a singer. He had become a cultural phenomenon. And this transformation was remarkable precisely because of where he had started. A poor boy from Tupelo, a shy teenager with a guitar, a young man who had been told that singing might not be his future. Now, he was one of the most famous entertainers in America. Yet fame brought something else with it: enormous expectations. The country wanted more Elvis, more records, more television appearances, more movies, more performances. And the young man who had once dreamed simply of being heard now found himself standing at the center of an entire cultural revolution. But this was only the beginning of his transformation into the king of rock and roll. Because just as Elvis reached the highest levels of fame, another chapter was waiting for him. One that would force him to step away from the stage, confront a completely different life, and eventually fight to reclaim his place at the top. Could the king remain the king when the spotlight disappeared? At the height of his early success, Elvis Presley was already one of the most famous young men in America. His records were selling millions, his face was everywhere, and millions of fans were watching his every move. Then, suddenly, the spotlight went away. In 1958, Elvis entered the U.S. Army. For a performer whose career had been built on music, television, and the excitement of the stage, military service meant stepping into an entirely different world. The famous hairstyle, flashy clothes, and screaming crowds were replaced by a uniform and military discipline. What happens when a man who seems larger than life is suddenly forced to live like everyone else? When Elvis returned from the Army in 1960, the world was still waiting for him. He quickly resumed his music career, but another opportunity was already changing the direction of his life: Hollywood. Elvis went on to star in a long series of films. The movies brought him enormous popularity and introduced his image to an even wider audience. But there was a price. His career increasingly became associated with commercial films and movie soundtracks. For some observers, the artistic edge and musical excitement that had made Elvis revolutionary seemed to be fading. The king was still famous, but was he still changing music? That question became harder to ignore as the 1960s progressed. Then came a crucial turning point. In 1968, Elvis returned to television for what became known as the '68 Comeback Special. Instead of simply presenting the polished image Hollywood had created for him, Elvis appeared with a renewed energy and confidence. He returned to the kind of powerful performance that had first made audiences pay attention to him. It was more than a television appearance. It felt like a reminder of who Elvis had been and who he could still become. The comeback helped restore his reputation as a serious performer and opened the door to another major chapter of his career. Soon, Elvis was performing in huge venues, including Las Vegas, where he became one of the biggest attractions on the entertainment circuit. The crowds were still enormous. The lights were still dazzling. The applause was still deafening. But behind the stage lights, Elvis's life was becoming increasingly complicated. The pressures of constant fame, demanding performances, personal problems, and growing health difficulties began to weigh heavily on him. This was the side of Elvis that audiences rarely saw. To millions of fans, he remained the confident, charismatic king who could walk onto a stage and command an entire room. But behind that image was a human being dealing with pressures that fame could not simply erase. Could the man who once seemed unstoppable really escape the consequences of a life lived under constant pressure? Elvis had reached the heights that almost no entertainer could imagine, but the higher he climbed, the more difficult it became to separate Elvis Presley the man from Elvis Presley the legend. And as the 1970s continued, that difference would become increasingly important. Because the final chapter of his life was approaching, and the world still had no idea how soon it would arrive. Part 8. At 42, the legend was gone, but the king never died. On August 16, 1977, the world lost Elvis Presley. He was only 42 years old. The news sent shockwaves across America and around the world. For millions of people, Elvis was not simply a singer they listened to on the radio. He had been part of their youth. They had watched him perform on television, bought his records, followed his career, and grown up with his voice in the background of their lives. And suddenly, he was gone. How could someone who seemed larger than life disappear so unexpectedly at only 42? For many fans, the moment they heard the news became a memory they would never forget. Decades later, people still recalled exactly where they were when they learned that Elvis had died. Some were at home, some were at work. Others heard the news from the radio or television. That detail says something powerful about the connection Elvis had created with his audience. His death was not simply the end of a celebrity's life. For an entire generation, it felt like the end of a chapter of their own youth. But something extraordinary happened after his death. Elvis did not disappear. His records continued to be played. His songs continued to reach new listeners. His performances continued to be remembered. And generations who had never seen Elvis perform in person began discovering the man who had once shaken America. His voice survived. His image survived. His music survived. And above all, the name The King survived. But Elvis's legacy is not simply about how many records he sold or how many hit songs he created. He changed what it meant to be a rock star. Before Elvis, popular singers were often expected to stand still and simply sing. Elvis transformed the stage into something much more physical and dramatic. His voice, movements, clothing, hairstyle, and attitude became part of the performance itself. He helped create the image of the modern rock and roll star, an entertainer whose influence could reach far beyond music. And perhaps that is why his story remains so fascinating. Elvis began as a poor boy from Tupelo. He was once a shy teenager with a guitar. He faced people who doubted him. He experienced rejection. Then, almost unbelievably, he became one of the most famous men on earth. He experienced enormous success, but also the pressures that came with living as an icon. And although his life ended far too early, the character he created on stage never truly disappeared. Nearly half a century after his death, people still listen to his songs. New generations continue to discover his voice. Fans still visit Graceland. His photographs remain instantly recognizable. Elvis Presley died in 1977, but the legend did not. So perhaps the greatest mystery is not why Elvis became famous. It is this: Why, nearly half a century after Elvis Presley died, does the world still call him the King?